In the popular memory of the Second World War, finance appears to be simple. The Allied powers raised money to defeat fascism. Nazi Germany seized resources, looted occupied countries, and turned its economy into a machine for conquest. Two sides fought, two systems collided, and the victors dismantled the financial network of the defeated. But the real history was far less clean. Long before German tanks crossed into Poland, American loans had helped stabilize German industry. Before the United States entered the war, major corporations had built deep partnerships with German firms that later became essential to rearmament. And even after the shooting began, banks in neutral countries continued clearing payments, moving gold, and protecting financial relationships that crossed enemy lines. This does not mean that a single secret group planned the war, or that every banker involved supported Hitler. The story is more uncomfortable than that. Many of the people who kept these systems operating believed they were defending something higher than any one government, the continuity of international finance itself. They saw war as temporary, contracts as permanent, and banking networks as institutions that had to survive whatever happened on the battlefield. To understand how money crossed the lines of World War II, we have to begin with the financial settlement of the war that came before it. When the First World War ended in 1918, Europe was not only physically devastated, it was trapped inside a giant chain of debt. Britain and France owed enormous sums to the United States. Germany was ordered to pay reparations to the victorious Allies. The Allies expected to use those German payments to service their own debts to American lenders. On paper, the arrangement looked orderly. In practice, it depended on Germany producing money it did not have. The Treaty of Versailles assigned Germany a reparations burden, later fixed at 132 billion gold marks. The number was politically satisfying to many Allied voters, but economically destructive. Germany had lost territory, resources, and export capacity. It was expected to pay vast external obligations while rebuilding a damaged economy and managing domestic political chaos. When tax revenues failed and foreign currency became scarce, the German state relied increasingly on the printing press. By 1923, the mark had collapsed. Wages lost value between payday and dinner. Families who had saved for decades discovered that their life savings could no longer buy a meal. Pensioners were ruined. Businesses could not price goods normally. The middle class, which had once believed in law, property, and gradual progress, learned that the financial system could erase a lifetime of discipline in a matter of months. Hyperinflation did not create Nazism by itself, but it destroyed trust on a massive scale. It taught millions of Germans that the existing order was either incompetent or fraudulent. And once that belief took hold, extremist movements gained an audience they had never possessed before. The crisis also threatened Wall Street. American banks had lent heavily to Britain and France during the First World War. If Germany could not pay reparations, the Allies would struggle to repay the United States. A German collapse therefore endangered not only Berlin and Paris, but New York. The solution was the Dawes Plan of 1924. It reduced Germany's immediate payments, reorganized its central banking arrangements, and opened the door to large-scale foreign lending. American capital poured into German bonds, municipalities, utilities, and industrial companies. J.P. Morgan and other major financial houses helped organize the flow. The money moved in a circle. American investors lent to Germany, Germany paid reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France used those funds to repay American war debts. The system created the appearance of recovery, but it did not solve the underlying problem. It merely replaced one obligation with another. For several years, the arrangement worked. German factories modernized, cities borrowed for infrastructure, industrial output recovered, foreign investors collected interest. Governments congratulated themselves for restoring stability. Yet the stability was conditional. Germany depended heavily on short-term foreign capital, and much of that capital could be withdrawn quickly. The entire structure rested on the assumption that American money would continue flowing. There was another consequence. The industrial modernization of the 1920s strengthened sectors that later became central to German rearmament: steel, chemicals, engineering, electricity, and machine tools. It would be misleading to say that American bankers deliberately financed the Wehrmacht in 1924. Hitler was not yet in power, and most investors were seeking returns, not war. But it is equally misleading to pretend that finance was disconnected from what came later. Capital rebuilt the productive base. The Nazi regime would eventually seize that base and redirect it toward conquest. Then Wall Street crashed. After 1929, American lending contracted sharply. German banks and companies suddenly faced demands for repayment. Unemployment rose into the millions. Municipal budgets broke down. Political violence intensified. The apparent prosperity of the previous years was revealed as a structure built on borrowed money. This is where the familiar story of Hitler's rise becomes incomplete. Nazi propaganda, nationalism, anti-Semitism, and political calculation all mattered. So did the failures of conservative elites who believed they could control Hitler. But beneath those events lay a financial collapse that had first destroyed savings through inflation and then destroyed jobs through deflation. The same international system that had stabilized Germany in the middle of the decade helped destabilize it at the end. And once Hitler took power, foreign capital did not simply disappear, it changed form. During the 1920s and early 1930s, major American and German corporations created partnerships that crossed national borders. These agreements were often structured as cartels. Companies divided markets, shared patents, limited competition, and exchanged technical knowledge. One of the most important relationships connected Standard Oil of New Jersey with I.G. Farben, Germany's giant chemical conglomerate. I.G. Farben produced dyes, pharmaceuticals, synthetic materials, and eventually military chemicals. It also became deeply integrated into the Nazi state and later used forced labor on an enormous scale. The partnership focused on technologies that were commercially valuable in peacetime and strategically vital in war. Germany had limited access to natural petroleum and rubber. Synthetic fuel made from coal and synthetic rubber could reduce that vulnerability. Without fuel, aircraft could not fly. Without rubber, trucks, tires, seals, hoses, and countless military components could not be produced at scale. The agreements between Standard Oil and I.G. Farben involved patents, research, and market control. Supporters of such arrangements described them as normal international business. Critics later argued that they helped Germany acquire or accelerate capacities essential to rearmament. The most important point is not that one American company single-handedly armed Hitler. It did not. German scientists, engineers, state subsidies, and domestic industry were central. The deeper issue is that corporate law treated technical cooperation as a private commercial matter even when the technology involved had obvious military consequences. Once governments began preparing for war, the line between commercial property and national security became impossible to ignore. In the United States, investigations during the early 1940s examined whether cartel restrictions had slowed the development of an American synthetic rubber industry. Congressional committees and the Justice Department scrutinized agreements that had been negotiated years earlier under very different political conditions. The companies defended themselves by arguing that international patent arrangements were legal when they were signed and that American industry was now fully committed to wartime production. That defense contained some truth. The United States depended on the same corporations it was investigating. Punishing them too aggressively could disrupt the factories, refineries, and supply networks needed to win the war. This created a pattern that would appear again and again. The government discovered troubling connections, imposed limited penalties, and then preserved the institution because the institution had become too important to damage. But corporate partnerships were only one part of the story. The more extraordinary institution stood in Basel, Switzerland. The Bank for International Settlements was created in 1930. Its original purpose was to help manage German reparations and provide a permanent forum for cooperation among central banks. From the beginning, the BIS occupied an unusual position. It was international, but not a world government. It served public institutions, but operated with the culture and secrecy of a private bank. Its officials believed that central bankers needed a place to speak beyond the pressures of elected politics. When war began in 1939, the BIS did not close. Its leaders argued that central bank cooperation would be necessary after the conflict, and that destroying the institution would make reconstruction harder. So the bank declared neutrality and continued operating from Switzerland. That decision sounds technical. It was not. The BIS maintained accounts for central banks on both sides of the war. Its directors included officials connected to Allied and Axis institutions. Transactions continued even as the countries represented around the table bombed one another's cities. The bank's most controversial role involved gold. Nazi Germany systematically stripped occupied countries of their reserves. It seized gold from central banks, from private owners, and from victims who had been robbed before deportation and murder. Some of that gold entered the international banking system after being mixed, resmelted, or transferred through official accounts. The BIS became part of that system. The best-known case involved Czechoslovak gold after the German occupation in 1939. Gold held abroad for the Czechoslovak National Bank was transferred after German pressure through BIS-linked accounts. Legally, the transaction was processed as an instruction between central banks. Politically, it meant that assets belonging to an occupied nation were delivered to the power that had occupied it. The episode exposed the moral weakness of financial neutrality. A banker could claim that an order was technically valid, that the correct signatures had been provided, and that the institution was merely following procedure. But procedure was taking place under military coercion. During the war, the Reichsbank also deposited gold with the BIS. Post-war investigations determined that part of Germany's gold reserves had been looted from occupied countries. The BIS later cooperated in restitution, but the central question remained. Should an international bank have continued processing assets for a regime engaged in conquest and mass murder? The man most closely associated with the BIS during these years was Thomas McKittrick, an American banker who became its president during the war. McKittrick moved through a world that seems almost impossible from a modern perspective. He maintained contact with German financial officials while also communicating with Allied representatives. He believed the BIS had to remain functional so that Europe would possess a financial bridge when the fighting ended. To some observers, this was pragmatic statecraft. To others, it was collaboration hidden behind institutional language. McKittrick was not a Nazi ideologue. There is no serious evidence that he supported the racial goals of the regime. But that does not end the moral inquiry. His case reveals a more subtle danger, a professional culture in which maintaining the system becomes more important than judging what the system is being used to accomplish. The bankers of Basel saw themselves as custodians of continuity. Governments might fall, borders might move, armies might destroy cities, but accounts, settlements, and central bank relationships had to survive. That belief allowed them to describe deeply political acts as neutral administration. By 1944, American officials at the Bretton Woods Conference pushed for the BIS to be dissolved. A resolution calling for liquidation was adopted. Yet the bank survived. Central bankers and European governments argued that it would be essential for post-war reconstruction. The liquidation plan was eventually abandoned. The BIS remains in Basel today, now known primarily as a forum and service institution for central banks. Its survival demonstrates how rarely major financial structures disappear, even when their wartime behavior becomes controversial. Institutions are usually reformed, renamed, or assigned new purposes. They are rarely erased. The same pattern appeared in commercial banking. When German forces occupied France in 1940, American banks with branches in Paris faced a choice. They could close, withdraw, or continue operating under occupation rules. Chase National Bank remained open. The branch operated in an environment where Nazi and Vichy authorities imposed anti-Jewish laws, froze property, and transferred control of accounts. Banking records and later investigations showed that American financial institutions participated in restrictions affecting Jewish customers. Here again, the question of responsibility was complicated by distance and control. Communications between occupied Paris and New York were limited. Local managers faced German authority. But internal correspondence also suggested that some officials regarded good relations with the occupiers as a business advantage. That detail matters. It transforms a story from one of helpless compliance into one of institutional accommodation. A bank does not need to share an ideology to profit from the order that ideology creates. It only needs to recognize the new rules, update the paperwork, and continue serving whoever holds power. After the war, victims and investigators sought answers. Some financial institutions eventually paid settlements, but criminal prosecutions were rare, and the banks themselves continued growing. Chase later became part of the institution known today as J.P. Morgan Chase. Another controversial case involved Union Banking Corporation in New York and its relationship to the German industrial network associated with Fritz Thyssen. Thyssen was a major steel and coal magnate who had helped finance Hitler's rise before later breaking with the regime. His international assets were connected through a network of companies and banks. Union Banking Corporation functioned as an American financial vehicle linked to those interests. One of its directors was Prescott Bush, later a United States senator and the father and grandfather of two American presidents. In 1942, the United States government seized Union Banking Corporation's assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act. Related entities were also affected. The official action established that the bank was holding property connected to enemy interests. The historical meaning of this seizure has often been exaggerated in both directions. It does not prove that Prescott Bush personally supported Nazism or directed German rearmament, but it also cannot be dismissed as irrelevant. He was part of a financial structure tied to industrial assets in a country at war with the United States. The case demonstrates how international ownership could conceal the political character of capital. Shares in holding companies made assets appear distant from the factories, mines, and regimes that ultimately benefited from them. On a balance sheet, ownership could be separated into layers. In the real economy, steel still became weapons. Sweden's Wallenberg family mastered this world of layered ownership better than almost anyone. Sweden remained officially neutral during the war, but its economy traded with both sides. The Wallenbergs controlled Stockholm's Enskilda Bank and a vast industrial network. One brother, Jacob, handled many relationships with Germany. Another, Marcus, maintained connections with Britain and the United States. This division allowed the family to operate across the conflict. Their defenders argued that Sweden's survival required flexibility. Their critics accused them of disguising German interests as neutral Swedish property. The most famous dispute involved assets connected to the Bosch engineering group. The Wallenberg Bank acquired or managed foreign subsidiaries in ways that American authorities later suspected were designed to protect German ownership from seizure. After the war, the United States blacklisted the Wallenberg brothers for a period and subjected their bank to financial restrictions. Once again, the punishment did not destroy the institution. The blockade ended, the family returned to the center of European finance and industry. Their companies helped shape Sweden's post-war economy. This is not simply a story about corruption, because corruption suggests a violation of the system's rules. Much of what happened was more disturbing. The rules themselves made it possible. Corporate law protected contracts. Banking law protected deposits and ownership structures. Central bank tradition valued continuity and secrecy. Neutral states treated commerce as a legitimate means of survival. Wartime governments avoided prosecutions that might damage industrial production or reveal how deeply their own economies were connected to the enemy. Each decision could be defended individually. Together, they created a machinery that moved money, patents, fuel, metals, and gold across the moral boundaries of the war. The easiest explanation is that these bankers were secretly loyal to both sides. Most were not. Their deeper loyalty was to capital, contracts, and institutional survival. They believed that politics was temporary and finance was permanent. That idea helped rebuild Europe after 1945. International banking cooperation stabilized currencies, financed reconstruction, and supported trade. The institutions preserved during the war later contributed to recovery. But the same principle also allowed bankers to separate their professional duties from the human consequences of their actions. A gold transfer could be processed without asking who had been robbed. A frozen account could be treated as a regulatory requirement rather than an act of persecution. A patent agreement could be defended as private property even when it strengthened a war economy. This is why the story does not fit neatly into a tale of heroes and villains. The men who managed these institutions often considered themselves responsible, rational, and civilized. They wore suits, wrote memoranda, attended board meetings, and spoke in the language of stability. They did not need to pull a trigger to influence the war. They only needed to ensure that certain accounts remained open, certain assets remained protected, and certain transactions continued to clear. The violence occurred elsewhere. The paperwork remained clean. After the war, accountability was selective. I.G. Farben executives were tried at Nuremberg, though many received sentences that now appear remarkably limited compared with the scale of forced labor and mass murder connected to the company. German industrialists and bankers faced varying degrees of punishment. Some returned to business within a few years. Their foreign partners were rarely placed under the same scrutiny. American prosecutors had little interest in turning Nuremberg into an investigation of the entire international capitalist system. Allied governments needed corporations to produce, rebuild, and compete with the Soviet Union. Political priorities shifted quickly from punishment to reconstruction. The result was continuity. The BIS survived. Major American banks expanded. The Wallenberg Empire endured. Corporate networks were reorganized. The people at the center of wartime finance often moved into respected post-war careers. What survived most completely was not any single company or family. It was the belief that finance stands above politics. That belief remains powerful because it contains a partial truth. Money must move between countries that disagree. Central banks must communicate during crises. Trade can prevent isolation. Financial institutions can outlast governments and help societies recover. But neutrality is never complete. Every transaction recognizes an owner. Every account protects someone's claim. Every loan strengthens one borrower over another. Every decision to continue business under occupation gives the occupying system a measure of stability. The bankers who operated across enemy lines during World War II were not merely keeping a machine alive. They were deciding whose property the machine would recognize, whose orders it would obey, and whose suffering would remain outside the ledger. That is the hidden economic history of the war. The battlefield divided the world into enemies. Finance kept searching for ways to connect them. And in the space between those two realities, some of the most powerful institutions of the modern age learned that they could survive almost any moral catastrophe as long as they continued to describe their choices as business. If this story changed the way you see World War II, tell me which part mattered most. The corporate cartels, the gold transfers, the occupied bank branches, or the decision to preserve the system after the war. Subscribe for more documentaries about the hidden forces of money, power, debt, and trade behind history's greatest conflicts. Because the most important decisions are not always made on battlefields. Sometimes they are made in quiet offices by people who believe the numbers matter more than the lives behind them.